please remember to leave a like, a comment, share the video about, and if you haven't already, subscribe. Thank you. Well, isn't this just fantastic? Captain's Log, subdates 230807.9. After a strong weekend of whiskey-fueled debauchery, we've got the NPC crew on hangover cure duty. This includes inserting all empty bottles, preferably broken, up Bork's ass, for science. He screams quite well if they're broken. Before we get into the subject itself, I want to insert a disclaimer. This disclaimer is, I don't care so much about the live-action remakes. I have no intention of watching them, because it's not my kind of movie, right? I am going to offer critique as I have for all previous ones. I don't think I've critiqued many of them, because they are seen as nothing more than a cash grab that has, while performing well at the box office, been reviewed quite critically and negatively. Also, the ginger side is apparently quite real when it comes to Disney's live-action adaptations. It's quite amusing. I don't care about the race swapping aspect, because that means nothing to me. Again, this isn't my area. I don't really care about that. But we're going to talk about Snow White and the Seven Companions, formerly Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. But we've covered it in EOSP how that has changed. EOSP is Exhibition of Stupid People, if you didn't already know, where a picture was doing its rounds, allegedly of Snow White, the fairest of them all, with the evil queen being Gal Gadot, so fairest is no longer about beauty, by the way, folks. Yes, I'm that kind of dickhead. It's instead other characteristics, which I understand 100%. Perhaps this Snow White is incorruptible. You may also find this particular Snow White also moonlights as Batman. Sorry, Batgirl, Batwoman, Bat-them. I do not know this individual's gender or pronouns, so I'm just guessing. Much information is coming to light, and rather amusingly, it has led to some rather tasty interactions on Piers Morgan's show concerning activists that support the casting for the companions and criticism that come from those that have been deprived employment. Because, as many of you will know, it's called Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but there's only one that's an actual dwarf, because some people had complained about the representation and the fact that it belittled the little people. Rather amusingly though, those who are themselves dwarfs, or little people, have been denied a job and they've said, bitch, work. Where is it? Because we're now not getting the opportunities. A critic of the Seven Dwarfs was actually a dwarf, Peter Dinklage. A very well-known critic, in fact, and it led to many calling him out by saying, you are taking the ladder out from beneath you, so no one else can get to where you are. Peter Dinklage has had a fantastic career since Game of Thrones. He really has. And I'll link down below something of relevance concerning Peter Dinklage on that. And I did cover it actually in an EOSP as well, because I felt that his comments, which I doubt were the only comments made, but they were comments enough that not long after, Disney announced Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, but they were going to recast and not have dwarfs, and instead go down the companions route. Which I think, if you deviate too much away from the source material, you're just latching onto the original name and running with that so you can fob it off as if it is the same. I don't think that's going to work in this one. Disney's been losing a lot of money of late with some rather bad products and projects. The MCU's a great example. It's still making lots of money, sure, but Phase 4's been dog shit. Do we now need to talk about Dial of Destiny? Because so far Disney has been putting out some lackluster content. Eventually it's going to find its way to the main staple content they're producing. That would include these live-action remakes. And I can't be the only one that thinks, by denying people of their ability to work with roles that are designed for them, you are in effect marginalizing people who are already marginalized. And there's a reason I use that language on purpose. Because the mental gymnastics, hence the title, involved to justify taking it away from people who happen to be on the same show with dwarves and Piers Morgan is astonishing, because they can't adequately convey just how dumb it is on the face of it to take away those kind of jobs. Of course, it's not an ideal situation to know that you are limited in what kind of roles you can get, but the criticisms that come are 100% valid. Whether that be comedians, whether that be performers, former wrestlers, there are many who are saying, bitch, this is not how you do it. This is not the right way of going about this. And that's what I want to talk about next, because some of those critics, their voices need to be heard. Whether I can play the clips, I don't know, but I'm going to try, alright? The first clip comes from TMZ and concerns a performer from Jackass, more commonly known as Wee Man. Now there are articles, so I'll play a very short clip of it, and I'm going to read his quote, because it's very important. I do also believe Wee Man manages to adequately convey a key point of this before we get to the Piers Morgan, Hornswoggle stuff. Okay.
Photos just came out showing that the Snow White movie replaced the 7 dwarves with 7 average people instead. Do you think Disney made the right choice doing this?
It's funny you should ask this, because a buddy of mine, we were talking about this the other day, and it's perfect timing for this because of all the AI and all that like SAG and the Writers Guild are going through. It's a bad thing.
You're replacing jobs that people could have as little people. Snow White and the 7 dwarfs. It's for dwarfs. Why are you hiring Snow White and the 7 average people? They need to redo the movie, recast. Sometimes you have to lose. They lost today. And now they gotta come back better. Make it better, Disney. Wee Man did bring up another point of interest, and that was the recent casting for the Oompa Loompas in the Wonka thingamajiggy going on, yeah? Okay. They'd cast Hugh Grant. Quote from Wee Man, Hugh Grant is now playing an Oompa Loompa, so I guess Hugh Grant, you're now identifying as a little person. Oh, interesting. I again think, yet again, you're taking away jobs from others because you decided not to cause offence, but in doing so, under the banner of progressivism, you've actually deprived people who are marginalised of employment. Instead of elevating, you've torn them down even further and discriminated against them. Just to have some context here, I'm going to read Peter Dinklage's original quote, because I think it's quite interesting what he said back then. They were very proud to cast a Latino actress as Snow White, but you're still telling the story of Snow White and the 7 dwarfs. Take a step back and look at what you're doing there. It makes no sense to me. You're progressive in one way, but you're still making that effing backward story about 7 dwarfs living in a cave together. Have I done nothing to advance the cause from my soapbox? I guess I'm not loud enough. Peter and I must have watched different versions of the Snow White cartoon as a child, because the 7 dwarfs from my childhood lived in a house. They worked in a cave, because they were miners. But the points from Wee Man again are valid. This is a big L for Disney. They're replacing jobs, and at the same time depriving jobs. And Peter Dinklage also makes a valid point as well now. If you take his quote and apply it now, it is a form of progressivism in one direction. But now because of what he said, it's being used to intentionally discriminate against others in 2 very large projects where dwarfs can actually be a prominent feature. That's not fair in the slightest, and I know the word fair is subjective, but it is applicable here. So we'll move on from Wee Man and go to Hornswoggle, who has absolutely laid into these people, who are taking the stance that this is a good thing with him present.
So it's not a progression at all to me. My issue with it is exactly what you said. There are actors, dwarf actors, that dream to be in a major motion picture such as this Disney remake. And now, because Peter Dinklage said what he said last year, now it's taken away. And it's taken away because of quote unquote progression and all that. And it's not right. Because these are roles made for actors of my stature. Roles that aren't ever really given.
What's quite amusing about this is the gentleman that is also on the show talking to Piers Morgan talks about how Warwick Davis had said that he doesn't like it. He gets really cringed out when people defend him, not realizing here that that doesn't mean that Warwick Davis disagrees with the change for Snow White, only that he doesn't like it when people defend him. Right, that's vitally important. Perhaps I should play a small amount of that clip so you get the context.
No problem with what Disney are doing. You think this is progressive and inclusive?
I think you should live in the 1930s, actually, Piers, because that's where you belong, really, listening to what you were just saying then. Also, I'm going to quote Warwick Davis, because he said he finds it patronising when people are offended on his behalf.
Well, let me bring in Dylan, because Dylan is also offended, and he happens to be a dwarf actor.
Naturally, though, the person who is espousing this as progressive and good, because of inclusivity, does have opinions later. We should get to those now as well. There are some rather titillating quotes that need to be referenced.
Now they use CGI there, Dylan, to effectively make him into an Oompa Loompa.
So now,
what do you feel about that?
Yes, sir. So now we're not only using CGI and spending extra money and funding for these movies when we could just cast dwarves in that role.
whether it be one dwarf or multiple, like they have been in the past. Now you're taking at least one role away or multiple roles away for Oompa Loompa characters.
While CGI is quite pricey, apparently this is another way of removing and reducing how many performers are in the production itself. When it comes to Wonka, everyone knows the Gene Wilder version is the best version. There is no other version that could ever come close, but they were very practical effects. It was simplistic in its performance. It stacks up to time because of how dated the story is. It's funny, right? Things have gotten so modernized now, we have to reduce it down to what we can put through a computer. And that does take away jobs from other performers who may well be dwarves, who apparently we can't call dwarfs as well, because some take offense. But there's more, don't worry.
Well, let's just go back to the 1930s, Piers. I think you'd be happy
You
there.
know what, James?
Blackface would exist.
James, you can't go, oh, you gotta go back to 1930s. No, James, if you agree with what I'm saying, you
I
can't
agree with what
get
you're
on
saying. I
Pierce's
don't agree
case
with
and
anything
say-
that Piers.
Yeah, here's the thing, Dylan. Dylan, just to be
He
clear.
literally just said what
Yeah,
I said, James.
Dylan, just to be clear, he doesn't agree when I say it, but when you say it, he agrees.
Because you're not
And
a dwarf.
That is the level of chimpery we are dealing with. Apparently an appeal to authority is the only way, the only fallacy, the only validation of a version or a reason existing, right? This is the level of intellect. This frustration, by the way, from Dylan throughout the entire interview was hilarious because he desperately tried to be heard, but as is often the case with those who are dwarfs, much like being seen, their voices also didn't carry enough to be able to be heard either. Neither Pierce nor James were willing to listen to him until he had exhausted himself. And Dylan was right. Jobs are being taken away from people under the guise of progression, but that's not progression, but it is often touted as progression. Actually, it's the same nonsense we have been dealing with for years, where instead of elevating everyone together, somebody has to pay the price and be torn down. Please tell me though, where in this holy scripture, people that are dwarfs or vertically challenged, and that doesn't just mean dwarfs, right? It says that they somehow benefit from additional privileges, so they must lose key roles that would actually benefit them beyond pantomime and the novelty of them existing somewhere in some capacity. Peter Dinklage set in motion events that have well and truly taken the rug out from many people, his own community of people. I don't know if he can understand just how damaging that is. Now, I do think it should be Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, therefore casting 7 dwarf actors. You could have actresses in there if you wish, but it should be dwarfs. I'm not trying to gatekeep for that type of product, but that's what the story is. Therefore, if you are making a live-action remake of it, you should stay true to something that is the story. But the desperation to deviate from it is ridiculous. And there is some proper deviation being announced already. I mentioned earlier the beauty aspect with a snide little comment. It's no different here. It's still the same thing. Who is the fairest of them all, huh? Apparently, the fairest of them all was Dylan Postal, Hornswoggle, and Dylan's not even in the movie. How embarrassing is that? By the way, if you can never agree with someone, and this is a point I'm going to make at the end here, you may not like someone, but if they make a point that is correct, you don't just disagree with them because you don't like them, they are still correct. Stop being so stuck up your own arsehole that you can't accept when someone is correct just because appeal to authority or a fallacy, a straw man, an ad hom. Oh, my fears. Shut the carp, alright? There are many creators on this platform I'm not fond of, but if they say something that's correct, I will say they are correct. Because it turns out, I am not so stuck up my own backside as to think that only I or only someone else who has the authority to speak on that position can be correct on an issue, a concern, a problem, a conversation. It is a form of arrogance, by the way. It's quite unbecoming.